Hello, I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we will be exploring the meaning of the near-death experience. With me is one of the pioneer researchers into that phenomenon, Dr. Kenneth Ring, Professor Emeritus from the University of Connecticut, Department of Psychology, co-founder and past president of the International Association for Near-Death Studies. Dr. Ring is the author of numerous books on the near-death phenomenon, including Life at Death, The Omega Project, Heading Towards Omega, Mind Sight, and Lessons from the Light. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure to be with you. I think by now it's probably the case that almost everybody has heard of the near-death experience, at least to some degree, but perhaps we should just summarize briefly what that experience is about.
Well, briefly, Jeffrey, it's an experience that many people report when they're on the verge of death. Typical account would say that the person feels a sense of tremendous peace and well-being. There's often a sense of separating from the physical body and being able to see the body as though a spectator to it from an elevated position. Then if the person goes more deeply into the experience, there's often a feeling of moving through a dark and closed space, sometimes described as like a tunnel, at an increasing speed. Often people say at the speed of light, sometimes even faster than the speed of light. They move toward a radiantly beautiful light, and then when they enter into the aura or the atmosphere of this light, many other things happen. They're flooded with a sense of universal knowledge, a sense of complete, absolute, unconditional love, and sometimes are asked to look at their life as though they have a panoramic review of their entire life. Sometimes they meet a spiritual entity or the spirit of a deceased loved one who tells them that they have to go back, and then they return to their body. Those are, I guess, some of the staple elements that together define the typical near-death experience narrative.
Now, from an academic perspective, I guess the main controversy is whether this experience that has now been reported by thousands and thousands of people, whether it's a hallucination or whether it might be evidence for some sort of ontological reality, some sort of after-death state.
Yeah, well, of course, this is the question, and it's been argued and probably will continue to be debated for years to come. It's been argued since 1975 in regard to the near-death experience. I think it is essentially an unresolvable question. Different people will come out on different sides of this, but we have evidence, and I present some in my book, Lessons from the Light, where it is very difficult to argue on the basis of this evidence that the experience is anything like an hallucination, a dream, a fantasy, or something merely subjective. And one source of evidence of this kind is when people who have near-death experiences and then float out of the body in the way that I was describing before, then go on to describe unusual objects in unlikely locations that they could not possibly know by normal means, and then these objects are independently confirmed. In addition to that, and again I have a chapter of this in Lessons from the Light, we've recently done research on people who are blind, and even those who are blind from birth can report classic near-death experiences and sometimes also describe being able to be aware of objects in their physical environment which can be independently confirmed by external witnesses. So it's data like these, among others, that suggest that whatever this experience it isn't merely something that people are imagining or dreaming or making up. We don't have any scientific explanation for it, at least from conventional science, but these facts and these observations are reported over and over again, so that science is going to have to take them into account one way or another.
Well, as a parapsychologist, I am comfortable with the idea that people in their normal state of consciousness can experience extrasensory perception. They can obtain information by other means than through the normal senses. What I find really compelling about the near-death experience is that it seems to have a transformative effect on people. People's lives are changed the way they would be through having an awesome mystical experience.
Yes. And this is another argument in favor of the idea that this is not an hallucination. Because it was a transient hallucination, first of all, hallucinations would probably be a lot more variable than the near-death experiences. And as you suggest, they wouldn't be expected to have these very profound and lifelong changes. And I've done studies, follow-up studies of people that have had near-death experiences many years previously. And a lot of the after effects of the near-death experiences are not just evanescent, but they last for seemingly for a very long time, if not the entire duration of a person's life. And these effects, I think, are just as interesting in their own way as some of the elements of the near-death experience are that I was describing earlier.
Let's talk about what some of these effects are.
Some of the main ones, and this has been found in a number of different studies that have been done in at least 4 different countries in the world, are a sense of a greater appreciation for life and for nature, a sense of greater feelings of self-worth. One of the most pronounced effects has to do with feelings about other people. There's a much heightened compassion and caring and concern for other people, a greater love for other people. People that have near-death experiences become less materialistic. They become less interested in impressing others or, being successful in conventional terms. They're much more spiritually oriented. They're not more religious, interestingly enough, but they say that they're much more spiritually oriented, and many of them seem to develop or awaken through this experience unusual psychic gifts that they say either were not present before or have developed much more to a much greater extent than had been the case prior to their near-death experience.
So this would be according to the self-reports, I
Yes.
presume.
But not only self-reports, because in some cases, for example, in one of my studies, we got behavioral assessments by people who knew these individuals well before their near-death experience and afterward, such as close friends or family members. And generally speaking, the same kinds of self-report information was corroborated by the people who were external witnesses to these individuals. Although often those persons didn't necessarily take the same view of these changes, they did concur that they actually did take place.
Well, it strikes me that the kinds of changes you're describing, more harmony with nature, greater love and compassion, better relationships, these are the same sorts of things that are ascribed to enlightenment, people who have gone through a process of spiritual evolution.
Well, I agree with that, and I think that one of the ways to understand what the near-death experience is, it is a spiritual transformation, and it leads to many of the same kinds of effects, at least in some of our stronger cases, as those are talked about, for example, in books on cosmic consciousness and very, very highly developed states of consciousness. It seems that the near-death experience is almost like I would say like a spiritual seed that's implanted in the individual, and then in the individual's life, as that seed is nurtured, it then begins to develop in this particular way, so that individuals do move into higher states of consciousness that are suggestive of, well, I'm not saying these persons are enlightened. I know, I would say that they're not, but they move in that particular direction. There's an unfolding of higher states of consciousness that seems to be potentiated by this experience.
You know, in my experience as a psychotherapist, I have seen people who have had the near-death experience, and the problem for them was that they were not living an evolved life. They were just ordinary people, sometimes involved in materialistic, even unethical activities, and they couldn't return to their old life after having had the experience, and that was very troublesome. They didn't, they were neither here nor there. They were lost.
Well, we have found this also, and that's why organizations like the International Association for Near-Death Studies that you mentioned earlier was set up to provide supportive and other kinds of services for persons who are having a difficult time working this through. You mentioned that they have better relationships. Well, I would qualify that. They care more about other people. But in fact, as often happens when death or a near-death incident occurs within a family, the strain on human relationships within the family or within the person's primary group is often very pronounced. So people have a difficult time working through these kinds of experiences and coming to terms with them and integrating them into their lives. So I'm not suggesting by any means that the kinds of transformative effects are easy on a person's life or on the well-being of their relationships with others. It really takes a lot of work, and therapy and other kinds of supportive services are often needed to help people negotiate these rather difficult passages.
Not long ago, for example, on my Virtual You radio program, I interviewed Betty Eady, author of Embraced by the Light. It sold probably over 1 million copies, and she's regarded as a highly evolved spiritual teacher these days, but she told me it took her nearly 20 years to get to the point where she had integrated her experience enough to talk about it and write about it.
Yeah, and I would say that although 20 years is probably a kind of an outside figure for most people, I have heard it estimated by other researchers that it may take something like 7 years in many cases or more to be able to pretty much fully integrate this experience. So it's interesting, Jeffrey, as a kind of contrast. Here a person has an experience, the near-death experience, and it may take place almost in a flash of a second, and yet it takes years and years to sort of work through what was given in that moment, as in mystical experiences where you can have an illuminated insight, within a very short period of time, and then maybe take 30 years to, to write a series of books to try to say what you learned in that particular moment. And that's very much the challenge that a near-death experiencer has to face as well. There's something tremendous that happens that changes psyche and soma in this particular experience, but the working out of all of that information and the living of it in such a way as to live with integrity and to honor the experience, that takes a lot of work. And that's why I would say caution against making too easy an assumption of seeing the light and being enlightened. No, seeing the light is maybe just like the first step, then people really awaken when they see the light, but the real work that they have to do follows the experience. It's not done automatically simply by having it.
Especially, I suppose, in our culture, which tends to be materialistic.
Right.
Ken, we're about to take a break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Thinking Aloud. I'm your host, Jeffrey Mishlove. My guest is Dr. Kenneth Ring, author of Lessons from the Light. Ken, it strikes me that the most intriguing aspect of the near-death experience is what you refer to as the life review process. When people see their lives, not just see, feel, experience in great detail, their whole lives flashing in front of them. And not only their lives, but even how their actions affect other people. It's as if they feel the emotions of the people who've been touched by them.
Well, not as if they do. I think this is one of the most remarkable aspects of a near-death experience, and it's one that's not really given the amount of attention that it should. Obviously, many people know about the light, they know about the out-of-body experience, but the thing that really is, I think, important about the near-death experience and in regard to the life review phenomenon is it isn't just a life review. It's a reliving of your life. And when people describe this, it's not always done in this way, but when people describe the full experience, it's every single act that you have done, every single thought that you have thought, every single word that you have spoken. Suddenly, all of this is back with you. You are running through it again, and as you say, you see and you experience the effects of these acts, these thoughts, and these words on other people. Let me just give you one brief example to illustrate this. I have a friend who who, when growing up, was kind of a roughneck. He had a hot temper, and he was always getting into scrapes. And one day, he was driving in his truck through the suburb in the town where he lived, and he almost hit a pedestrian. And he got very aggravated at this pedestrian, and he was a very big physical guy, still is. And a fight ensued, and he punched this guy out and left him unconscious on the pavement, got back into his truck and roared off. 15 years later, this guy has a near-death experience. Oddly enough, it was caused by an accident in regard to his own truck at that time. But in any event, he has a near-death experience, and during the near-death experience, he has a life review. And in his life review, this particular scene of the fight takes place again, comes up in his life review. And he said that, as many people do, he kind of experienced this from a dual aspect. There was a part of him that was almost as if he were high up in a building, looking through a window and seeing the fight below. But at the same time he was observing the fight like a spectator, he found himself in the fight, except this time he found himself in the role of the other person. And he felt all 32 blows that he had rained on this person originally 15 years ago now being inflicted upon himself. He felt his teeth cracking. He felt the blood in his teeth. He felt everything that this other person must have felt at that particular time. It was a complete role reversal, an empathic life review experience. And this is the sort of thing that many people report. And when they report these kinds of experiences, they realize that in our life, we are the very people that we hurt. We are the very people that we help to feel good. And we experience these actions as though done to ourselves in the life review. So that when people start talking about the golden rule in the context of the near-death experience, the golden rule is not just a precept for moral conduct, it's the way it works. and you experience this during the life review, and you learn that lesson in a very forcible way as a result of going through this kind of experience. And that's why when people have NDEs, they change as much as they do, because if you can even imagine what it must be like to go through your entire life and see everything that you've ever done without judgment, but from a kind of almost omniscient point of view with regard to the effects of those actions, and see what your actions do to other people, it's a heavy kind of lesson, and it's something that stays with you, and it informs your conduct for the time after your near-death experience.
The implications of what you're saying are just enormous. It touches on ethics, it touches on theology, it touches on psychology. It goes, I think, it just rips the whole field of psychology apart to try and grasp something like that that cannot be contained within a single academic discipline. It's reminiscent to me of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth.
Well, I think a lot of the aspects of the near-death experience do burst our understanding of what's possible in science. I mean, how is it possible that in one instant outside of time, your entire life can be laid there before you, and you can experience everything in terms of the effects on other people and come back with that particular understanding? It's not possible, and yet it happens. It doesn't happen in just a few cases. It happens repeatedly to people. So it does give us a lot to think about, and that's why I say in my book, Lessons from the Light, the near-death experience isn't given just to those who have the experience. It's given to all of us to learn from, because all of us can profit by the lessons that near-death experiences learn in the course of the life review or other aspects of their experience, and we can grow from these lessons, and we can apply these lessons into our daily life.
I have to think that people watching this program right now must feel very moved learning about this.
Well, I like to think that they at least would ponder this, and one of the things that I've done in some of my classes and some of my workshops is I don't necessarily have to take it from my book. You can go to almost any book on the near-death experience that talks about the life review and cull similar examples. But I take about a half a dozen of these stories, like the one that I just related to you about the guy getting into that fight. And I ask people to read these stories very slowly in an almost meditative way, and then to reflect on them. And then after they do this for perhaps 10 minutes, I ask them to complete the following sentence. When I reflect on these commentaries in relationship to my own life, comma, and when people have that stem of the sentence, and they begin to, and they have this kind of information, it's a very, very powerful exercise. I've seen people weep in terms of some of the realizations that they come to, and I often have people then discuss the insights that they get. And this is one of the ways that people can put the near-death experience to work in their own lives, simply by taking these accounts and by, in a sense, internalizing them and realizing that, yeah, this is going to be your experience. I mean, if this is on the level, if we are really going to experience when we die what our entire lives have been about and our effects on others, it will make us very reflective. And as some of the near-death experiencers that I've talked with who have had this experience have told me, they now think ahead of time. They almost like do a little processing. They say, how do I want to see this particular scene in my life review? And so they use this information not just in a retrospective sense of how they've actually acted, but as a way to program or rehearse certain kinds of actions, because they can anticipate that they're going to be experiencing this from all sides, not just from their own ego-invested side.
It makes me think that it would be much easier for me to forgive other people for various behaviors that I'm judgmental about, knowing that they're going to inevitably experience the consequences of their behavior.
Yeah, I think one of the things that the near-death experience does, and even reading or hearing about it does, is it tends to increase your compassion and your understanding of other people. You know, and one of the things that happens in the near-death experience is people are not judged. There is no sense of external judgment, and when people are responded to that way, there's a price. First, you have to look at your life. So just as you say, can you imagine what the life review of Hitler would have been like to have gone through? Because one of the things that people say about the near-death experience in regard to the life review is that you become aware of the consequences of your actions, whether you intended them or not, and even whether you are aware of the repercussions or not. So, I mean, if you think of all the ramifications of Hitler's decisions about how things were going to be done prior to and during World War II, not just with the Jews, but with all the atrocities, you know, that man died over 50 years ago. You wonder whether his life review is over yet.
Well,
Perfect justice.
It seems as if the life review takes place outside of our normal space and time.
It does.
Because it might take forever.
Yes. Yeah, I'm saying, just, yeah, I'm not really meaning literally that his life review is not over yet, but because people say in the near-death experience, and when they have the life review, that they are outside of time, and yet they can process all this information. And a lot of people, not to give it a heavy tone, because people have the near-death experience, they don't say, I don't want people to feel guilty about this. I don't want, they say, it's like a learning experience. It's meant to show you something. Because Hitler obviously is the most extreme case that we can use. In the normal case, what people say about the near-death experience and what they learn from the life review is it shows them something. It teaches them something. It is a teaching. It's not something that's meant as a punishment or to scare people. And none of my remarks should imply that. It's meant to wake people up so that they simply become aware of the consequences of their actions before committing those actions, knowing that they themselves are going to have to be the recipients of them. It's as if there's only one person in the universe, and it's us.
Well, Dr. Kenneth Ring, you're really showing me here that the near-death experience is not just for the experiencers, but it's for all of us who are hearing of it and learning about it. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Hello, I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we're continuing our exploration of the near-death experience. My guest is Professor Emeritus Dr. Kenneth Ring, former member of the Department of Psychology at the University of Connecticut. He is co-founder and past president of the International Association for Near-Death Studies. Dr. Ring has written numerous books about the near-death experience, including Life at Death, The Omega Project, Heading Toward Omega, Mind, Sight, and Lessons from the Light. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure to be with you again. In our previous interview, we talked about what may be misnamed as the life review process. You made the point that it's not just a review of our past experiences, like some people would say, my life flashed in front of me. It's a profound re-experiencing of one's life, along with all of the impact that one has had on other people.
Yeah, it's a total experience. The life review is almost the passive aspect of it, but it really is a reliving of your life, and that's the term that some people use. And as you say, when we go through life, it's almost like we go through life with blinders, because we're not fully aware at the time or even afterward of all the effects of our actions, nor do we think that our thoughts and feelings have effects in their own right. But when we go through the life review experience, we see we have the full picture. As I was saying, we have an almost omniscient understanding of our actions, of why we do the things that we do, and how they have particular kinds of consequences in the lives not only of ourselves but of other people.
Now, I have to think...
So it's a revelation, really. It's a revelation.
It sounds awesome.
Yeah.
But I would have to think that many of your colleagues in the psychology profession, in particular, probably the most skeptical of all of the sciences when it comes to these sorts of experiences, that they must say we cannot accept these at face value because these experiences transcend any other kind of experience that we know about. The very thought that somebody in a matter of moments can review their life and experience what other people felt, it would seem impossible.
Well, I think on the face of it, it does, and in terms of conventional science, it is. But the thing is that these experiences break the walls of conventional science down, and they open fissures in those walls, and we have to be able to peer through those fissures and to have a much broader view of what really is possible. The thing is, yes, these experiences on the face of it are impossible, but they happen. They happen repeatedly. They can be documented. Many people in different countries tell the same stories, and in some cases, especially in the early days of near-death experience research, people thought they might be the only ones in the world that were having these kinds of experiences. But when you collate these accounts, you see that they form a regular pattern. Now, I'm not saying that we can easily explain these experiences. We can't. But I think to dismiss them as if they don't really happen when they exist in such plenitude is a kind of ostrich-like blindness. It just won't work. People are going to have to begin to pay attention to these experiences in science. They're already paying attention to it outside of science. The near-death experience has been around, at least from the time of Raymond Moody's research, since 1975, a quarter of a century. It's here to stay, and people are going to have to reckon with it, and scientists included.
Well, I think some scientists would say, yes, granted, people are reporting these experiences, but are they actually interpreting their own experience fairly or accurately, or could they be suffering from some sort of, let's say, lack of oxygen in the brain that causes them to form mistaken ideas about their own experience?
Well, of course, it's possible, although there have been studies of oxygen levels in people that have had near-death experience. In some cases, they are not abnormal, and yet the experiences are reported. In fact, there are some cases that are so extreme in terms of the physiological parameters involved, and yet the experience is identical to what is reported, you know, in ordinary cases of NDEs, that those arguments, again, the number of the month is sort of, you know, in those Sunday supplement type of articles. Well, what if during the near-death experience, you know, the entire neuronal grid, as it were, was lit up? What would our experience be if all of our neurons were sort of functioning and firing at this particular time? Would we not have, for perhaps that particular instant, a kind of universal knowledge? That seems to be what people phenomenologically are reporting during this experience. We need to do the kinds of scientific studies that talk about changes in brain function, perhaps, to be able to begin to understand what may actually mediate these tremendous experiences that people are reliably reporting during these near-death encounters.
But as a scientist, Ken, how can you operationally define a term like universal knowledge?
Well, I think all that we can do is simply give the reports that people give us of their experiences. They say this repeatedly, that they had omniscience, or they had a kind of universal knowledge pour into them. Many mystics have said exactly the same thing when they have their experiences. In my view, the near-death experience is a kind of mystical experience. And so even though we can't operationalize these kinds of experiences, or say, here are the operations that we can do to induce this particular experience, what we can do, at least at this point in our research, is collate all of these accounts and see their commonalities, not only among near-death experiences, but with other allied experiences, such as mystical or religious or experience of cosmic consciousness. All of these experiences seem to be, if not brothers, then at least cousins in the same family. And the kinds of explanations that are offered for one would presumably suffice to be able to explain the others.
Now, in the Yoga Sutras, for example, and many other texts for spiritual discipline, spiritual awakening, it is said that when one engages in a particular practice, certain experiences occur, and also certain powers, gifts of the spirit, powers of the mind occur. And I gather that you've documented these as well.
Yes, in fact, I make exactly that same point in my book, Heading Toward Omega. I talk about the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali and say that as a consequence, or as a byproduct of spiritual development, certain psychic powers or other kinds of gifts begin to unfold quite naturally. That's what seemed to happen in near-death experiences, and there have now been probably at least a half dozen, maybe 10, somewhere in that vicinity, studies of the development of people following near-death experiences, and a very high proportion of these people, as I was saying earlier, do develop very definite psychic gifts that they say either they did not have before these experiences, or they had to a very small degree, and something about the near-death experience seems to have actuated them and brought them in from a more or less latent state into a state of realization. That is one of the very common after effects of near-death experiences. And again, we only have the reports that people give, but the reports are so common, Jeffrey. If you took 100 people that had near-death experiences, probably at least half of them, if not more, would say that their psychic awareness decidedly increased, markedly increased after their own NDEs. It's almost as if there is an opening. There is an opening of a kind of channel, and when that channel begins to open, then these kinds of experiences can flow through. People become more intuitive, they become more psychic, they have a higher level of awareness. Some of them may channel, and this it's as if once the dam bursts, a lot of material of higher consciousness begins to flow through.
Healing, for example, is something that you write about, and there I would think we can get medical corroboration.
Yeah, at least potentially. There actually have not yet been performed really good scientific studies of people that have NDEs, but we do again have self-report data. For example, there was one study in Australia that said something like about 8% of the people that had near-death experiences, before their experience, had some healing gifts, and after that, something like 2/3 of those people reported healing gifts. And healing abilities, again, a gift of the Spirit, to put it in that kind of language. Healing gifts are one of the very commonly reported after effects from near-death experiences, and they do deserve to be better studied by scientists. In fact, I would have to say, in all candor, that one of the weakest aspects of the field of near-death studies is that we do not have the degree of scientific corroboration for many of the claims that have been made by near-death experiencers. But these claims, again, are so pandemic that they have to be acknowledged and addressed, and I think people who are interested in subtle energies and other forms of modern science that would connect with a near-death experience, a lot of these people will certainly begin to do these kinds of studies, and I think if they do, will corroborate many of the claims that we have now only on the basis of self-reports.
Well, there certainly is a whole new line of research opening up in distant healing.
Yes.
There ought to be some opportunities there, I suppose, as this whole area of transpersonal psychology and distant healing and parapsychology opens up and becomes, shall we say, unified with the field of near-death research. One would expect more and more kinds of synergistic research to occur.
Well, I certainly hope that in many of the talks that I've given, I've tried to encourage people from all of these disciplines to take a look at the near-death phenomenon and begin to research it in laboratories and in other objective settings so that we can really extend this field beyond the level of self-report where it mostly exists now.
Ken, we're about to take a break.
I'll be prepared.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to Thinking Aloud. I'm your host, Jeffrey Mishlove. My guest is Professor Kenneth Ring, one of the leading authorities in the world on the phenomenon of the near-death experience. He is author of Lessons from the Light and a half a dozen other books. Ken, it strikes me that the most significant aspect of the near-death phenomenon overall is that it lends an enormous amount of credence to a world view which is very different from our conventional materialistic scientific way of seeing the world, and very similar to what Aldous Huxley referred to as the perennial philosophy, or Houston Smith calls the primordial tradition, the kind of basic assumptions that underlie the religions of the world.
I think it does connect with that, and one of the things that has struck me in my research on this phenomenon, and I think is also true for other people who have looked into it, is that people who have this experience, almost regardless of their initial point of view, if they were religious or if they were not religious, if they were spiritual or not spiritual, if they were atheistic or not, they come to have almost a similar point of view along the lines of the perennial philosophy. They describe themselves as much more spiritual people, not necessarily more religious, and they make such statements as, I feel as if I would be at home in any church, or all religions have truth. There are a lot of pronouncements that if people were made by near-death experiencers, which if they were familiar with the idea of a perennial philosophy, they would have no difficulty in endorsing. I think this is a very beautiful aspect of the experience, too, because it suggests that once you have this kind of awakening, whether through a near-death experience or in some other way, then you come to a point not only of this kind of realization, but you have a sense of tolerance and appreciation for the diversity of religious or spiritual worldviews, but you see it within this sort of overarching framework of the perennial philosophy or the universality of a spiritual framework.
You've even documented, as I recall, cases of people who were adamantly atheistic,
Yes.
who then have the near-death experience. And how do they integrate it?
Well, the people that I've talked with who have described themselves as skeptics, as agnostics, or as atheists often have difficulty using religious terms afterward, but they know what they've experienced, and the term, which is almost a code word in a certain sense, for this is the light. They don't have any difficulty talking about the light, but they might have difficulty talking about God or more obviously religious terms. But if you look at the way they describe the experience, and if you look at the kinds of changes they report in their life, and their opening to spiritual worldviews, you can see that their previous skepticism or agnosticism or even atheism has been eroded to such an extent that it virtually dissolves, and they become very spiritually oriented people too.
And when we talk about the light, my impression is that we're describing an intelligence. It's not just some sort of visual
Yes,
sensation.
absolutely.
It's as if one is there in the presence of a great, comforting, wise, intelligent, spiritual guides, for example, who help us to process.
There's so many things that are associated with this light, it's almost impossible even to give a verbal description of it that's in any way adequate. I think even the powers of a Dante, frankly, would be insufficient to be able to describe what's in this light. But yes, there is an incredible intelligence. There is an energy associated with this light. There is a feeling of love beyond this world, of almost an absolute love, and that when people have the experience of the light, it isn't that they become aware of these dimensions. They become absorbed in them, and they understand that they are made of that light. You know, the light is not something that is other. It's that you merge with the light, and that energy and that intelligence and that love infuses itself into you. And that's why I think when people come back from this radiant experience, that they're almost like beings of light themselves. I mean, to the extent that they can remove, you know, kind of their ego dross, if I can put it that way. If they can remove that covering, then the light that they experience during their own near-death encounter shines through them. I think that's why they are so compassionate, so loving, and why they have this kind of knowledge, because the light is an energy and intelligence which can be absorbed in the near-death experience. Even if a person can't consciously understand what has happened to him or her, nevertheless that absorption takes place and is somehow reflected in their daily conduct and in their consciousness when they come back from the experience.
You write about one near-death experiencer, I believe, who became a friend of yours, and he was very eloquent and articulate about the nature of the light, that the light itself was composed of, if I recall correctly, it's as if it was the higher self of everybody.
Yes. I remember this particular man, and he had a very unusual experience, because when he went into the light, he had a question, and he said, "What are you really? You know, what is this? What are you?" And he said that he was not just enabled to enter into the light, but he passed through the light. And when he could, as it were, look back on the light, he saw it was almost like a constellation of human souls. That it was everybody's higher self, as you were describing. And again, that had a tremendous effect on this particular individual. But his experience went deeper, deeper than most. And in one chapter, I know the one that you're referring to in Lessons from the Light, I present some cases like his of the deepest, the most complex near-death experiences that I've discovered in the course of my research. And in all of these, although I don't have many of them, as with this man, people go into and then through the light, and they seem to go almost as if on a journey through the universe, and they get to a second light. They get to something that seems to be the primordial light, or the light of creation, or the light of God. I don't even know what terms are adequate to describe it. This man was one of those who had something more like the full near-death experience, although obviously he never died, but he penetrated further than most people ever have an opportunity to do.
The sense that I have is that what these people are telling us is that my soul is linked to the soul of everyone else,
Right.
that we are common, we share a soul in common, and that common soul that we all have links us to the Absolute.
I think that's very well put, and I think what we have here in this world, we have a sense of division and separation. We are many bodies, but in the light, no pun intended, of the near-death experience, you realize there's only one being, and we are all connected to it. It's as if that primordial light that I was talking about that's where we really belong, that's where we really are. And so many people say, even when they enter into the experience of the light, I was home. One man said, "This is where I always was and always will be, and my life on earth was just a brief instant." So it's like in this brief instant that we call life, of course, which seems to expand and seems to be the totality of it. I mean, that's maybe all that we are aware of, but when we have the near-death experience, we realize this life is just a flicker, and where we really are and where we truly have our being is in that primordial light, and there we are truly all one. We are truly all one anyway, but we have the realization that we are one. We know it, It's not just an intellectual conviction.
Well, this is very graphic testimony to what mystics have been saying throughout the ages.
To me, the near-death experience is a type of mystical experience that's brought about by the proximity of death. Its essence is no different from a mystical experience. The only thing that's different about it are the circumstances that bring it into a person's awareness. And it's almost as if we're having an influx of mystical experience these days because of the availability of resuscitation technology that brings many people back from the brink of death and enables them to relate these stories to people like myself who are chroniclers of them, to people like you who are broadcasters of them, so that people understand that the mystical worldview is one that really can be reached from a number of different perspectives or avenues, I could say, of which the near-death experience is only one. But it teaches the same thing as traditional mystical experiences have taught us.
Well, it's very powerful testimony, and the fact that it's occurring within a scientific framework suggests to me the possibility that what you've been taking part in since you co-founded the International Association for Near-Death Studies a quarter century ago is a cultural movement of great significance.
Well, of course, it's hard to say where this is going, but I think many people who have taken the trouble to study or to read about or just inform themselves about near-death experiences can see the implications of them are very large, and this is what I try to bring out in my books and in my talks generally. But my attitude toward the near-death experience has always been invitational. I don't think it has any one truth or any one perspective that it inevitably leads to. My approach has always been to invite people to consider the near-death experience and come to their own conclusions. But I know that whatever their conclusions might be, the exploration of these experiences will be richly rewarding.
To me, the one conclusion that is suggested by all of these accounts is that life has a purpose.
Yes.
And that is profound from the point of view of materialistic science, which says just the opposite.
And it's almost universal that near-death experiencers say that. They say, I know that my life has a purpose. I know that life has a meaning. It is a big anecdote to kind of the bleak existentialism that was, so common, say, in the mid-20th century. That point of view simply is not maintainable in the light of the near-death experience. The sense of purpose, the sense of meaning is so much a part of this experience that it cannot be extracted, nor can it be, it can't be doubted. It's an inextricable part of the near-death experience, and people who study it will understand that if those experiences give us a sense of meaning, then even those of us who haven't had the experience can be buoyed up by the fact that there is meaning and purpose to our world.
Dr. Kenneth Ring, thank you so much for being with me.
My pleasure, Jeffrey. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for being with us.